Welcome back to the Insurgent Mindset. I'm Matt Tice.
And I'm Rondo Moses. This is a podcast about challenger thinking in a world shaped by disruption.
And Rondo, in each episode, we try to explore the strategies and leadership mindsets that really help businesses break from the pack and stay ahead in these fast-changing times.
That's right, our audience, you're going to hear conversations, case studies, and insights from leaders who are applying those mindsets to thrive in this uncertain environment.
And if this topic's interesting to you, we'd encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, or of course, you can follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and you can also find our companion blogs at insurgentsgroup.com for a summary of the takeaways from each of our episodes. Rhonda, let's get into it. What are we talking about today?
Today, we're going to be talking about government insurgency, so insurgents in government.
Almost an oxymoron.
That's right. I mean, most people think about insurgency, they picture startups or challengers in business, but insurgency isn't limited to the markets. It happens in government too. It does.
And I think it's fun because, I think there's been a lot of, obviously it's been a, a bit of an up and down year in government just generally, with, the Doge in the US and, obviously globally, I think more for less seems to be the mantra for government. And I'm not convinced that government has the skills, capabilities, and certainly the leadership mindsets required in some cases to be able to apply the things that we talk about, sort of disruption and change, and to really create alternative business models, solutions, et cetera. So but there is some light daylight, right? There are some
Yeah.
examples I think of where we do see some application of these techniques and mindsets to really create some great government services for citizens and other things. So I'm looking forward to getting into it.
Yeah, I think there's some good examples that we can point to of where it's done. It's not, I think, a wholesale approach to government, but I do think that there are pockets of brilliance in terms of insurgency in government that we can point to.
Yeah, so let's set the table a little bit. I think fundamentally, um, we've talked a lot about productivity on the podcast, Rondo, and I think that
Yeah.
you know, in government in general, I mentioned more for less. I suppose that
Excuse me.
productivity has been down and the expectations of performance are up, but really performance is flat or declining across most or many of the different, at least in Western economies, um, most or many of the different sectors. So I don't know, the cost of primary education is virtually doubled in the last 10 years. Healthcare costs are up. Costs per unit in defense are up. You pick a sector and, virtually every sector is under pressure from, kind of less budget, but higher expectations from citizens, but not able to step up to the mark on productivity.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that, when we think about government, most of us think bureaucracy, we think red tape, but like I said, I do believe that there's examples of when some agencies have reinvented themselves or departments have reinvented themselves and done the right thing. And I think when they take on a more business-oriented mindset and business examples, they can become insurgent inside the government.
That's kind of an interesting point, right? So government often, or not always, but often is not really exposed to market forces. So fundamentally,
Right.
you're not in a fully contestable competitive environment. It's hard to imagine you know, how you can get people off the bench into the game, trying to drive that change. It's sort of steady as she goes. So then consequently, you end up getting this very incremental kind of innovation approach to drive that change, which is, to try to do what you're already doing or have already done for maybe decades, a little bit
Yeah.
better, a little bit faster, a little bit cheaper. And you don't get that sort of systemic wholesale change, or in using our language, I suppose, is you don't get a lot of um, government leaders fundamentally tearing down and rebuilding business models because there isn't that sort of outside in kind of pressure that we would experience from, if you're a big incumbent, I mean, government's the biggest incumbent, right? So if you're a big
Right.
incumbent in corporate life, you've got startups nipping at your heels, stealing your customers, challenging at the edges. You got platform companies and technology companies. You don't even know who your competitor is. And in government, that pressure just doesn't feel like it's always there. So I think from
Yeah.
a point of view of it's just the starting point, it makes it difficult to, kind of, as I said, get into the game on this.
But I think sometimes, with government, they've sort of stumbled into it or been forced into it because of crises or, just an intense amount of pressure from citizens. So, for example, you think about the implementation of the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare here in the US. And I think 2014, when they tried to implement the healthcare.gov website here, it crashed.
Hmm.
And President Obama and his administration pulled together a team of technology experts from outside of government, from Google, Microsoft, Amazon, I believe, was involved. And, within, like, I think weeks, working it through sprints, they were able to get the website up and running and servicing, millions of Americans, helping them be able to get their healthcare. But prior to that, I mean, they opened the site and the traffic that went to the site just crashed it because they took so long to develop that. But so
Hmm.
after this success of bringing in this outside talent, they created this US Digital Services Group that then, started to work more like a traditional technology company, operating more agile, like with sprints, et cetera. But this was an example of bringing in sort of the non-government experience, that technology experience, that agile approach into government, and they were able to transform the way that site and that experience to the American citizen.
Okay, so
That's
these
one
techniques
example.
can be applied in government,
Yeah,
right? So,
yeah,
but like everything else, right? So it's the burning platform you just described, right? The thing crashed and you're up against the wall. There's a lot of political pressure. That sort of creates that sort of proxy for that outside competitive pressure that we talked about,
right.
right? So often without that, you don't get that sort of major change. Well, what could they be like? Budget shortfall, like we can't meet budget, or you guys are experiencing that in the US right now. That's going to play a role. To your point, natural disaster. So that could play a big role. We had the bushfires here in Australia and in 2019, and it was really interesting to see how, a purely government approach never would have worked, but there was like this mass mobilization of community volunteers and things like that, which enabled millions of tons of maybe not millions, but at least tens of thousands of tons of aid and support to get out to these communities where the government's co-opting or co-creating with the community to achieve some of the outcomes. But again, a crisis, so that's I think harder in a steady state. But of course, it's the same for big corporates when there is, it's when you're sailing along, obviously the pressure to change or to implement new capability technology to blow things up and rebuild them tend to be very low.
But I think about how, when we went through the COVID pandemic, the COVID vaccine was approved in under a year when
Mm,
normally that would take, 5 to 10 years to get approval. So I think and the FDA is another example of where that level of insurgent thinking has taken hold. When you think about their breakthrough therapies, they were able
mm.
to redesign the process for these life saving drugs for treating serious conditions to shrink it from, that 5 to 10 years down to, a year or less. And that's a perfect example because the drug approval usually have these sequential phases with long timelines. And so to get that down to a year was monumental. That's like a real leap forward for the FDA. Now, that's not for all drugs, but when you're dealing with a serious condition and life-saving medication, I think that's really a great way and place to use insurgent thinking and insurgent approaches.
Right. So, but again, that's anchored by a crisis. But I think your point about once you can demonstrate that, then the expectation is no longer 10 years, maybe it's 5 years. So even still,
Right.
it's a significant leap forward. I'm really interested also in sort of what NASA's been doing, right? So, kind of they had a monolithic we build everything approach in sort of the 60s, but that
Mm,
was a crash program that was really, really successful and all things equal, really quick, right? So you're talking 7 years from idea to the moon. Um, and you sort of watch NASA over a course of 50 years, and that shit is, they kind of, they fell into that deep bureaucratic trough in the 70s, 80s, probably into the 90s. But the most recent incarnation of NASA is kind of this dual um, public-private kind of organization where what NASA's ultimately done is stepped back from the delivery of a lot of the programs and tried to create a marketplace and
mm,
stimulate the marketplace for all things space. And largely that has really upped the pace in terms of innovation. I don't know how many startups there would be in space, but even here in Australia, we've got a couple dozen space-related startups that are focused on virtually every part of the puzzle. And so that big shift of maybe the government letting go a little bit and giving more opportunity for creating and stimulating private competition, I think is another model that sort of emerges and is very interesting.
so it's more like an ecosystem mindset that the government brings to it.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of probably three things. I think that's absolutely part of it, right? So the realization that not we can't afford, nor can we build all the capability ourselves to deliver these programs. And just in that sort of to your point about that bureaucratic mindset, um, it becomes so impossible just to navigate getting these programs off the ground, managing it monolithically. Then it
Hmm.
shifts to this sort of um, kind of private competition model where NASA, rather than being the general contractor, the builder, and the commissioner, is really just sets the vision and then allows others to be the general contractor, and then fundamentally just plays the role of the commissioner, right? Sort of
Hmm.
kind of approval of these things. And then I guess the last thing um, is then creating and stimulating opportunities for people to make money here, right? Um, there's listed companies, there's private public partnerships and so forth that are monetizing space, whereas before you really couldn't get a piece of it, could you? So fundamentally, then there's no shareholder sort of pressure like we talked about before. So I really like this model in a sense. It's not perfect. You still have what is it, the constellation that's taken decades to kind of get off the ground, and
Yeah.
sort of watching that in parallel with what SpaceX has been doing with the super heavy, and that program has kind of been interesting to watch those two things in parallel. The perfection approach, kind of the old NASA approach, versus the kind of lean startup approach.
Yeah, I was thinking about another example as you were talking. So when I was doing some research and came across Colorado's My Colorado app. Um, those of us who have to deal with the DMV here know how much of a headache that can be. Just going in and dealing with the long lines and the frustrated workers sometimes. But Colorado created this My Colorado app that allows the citizens of Colorado to have store their drive. So it's like a digital wallet. It stores their driver's license. They can also connect to like 20 different agencies through this app. So their shift to focus really on the citizens and treating citizens like customers, I think has allowed them to think more like an insurgent. That ability to deliver services that way and digitally is a great idea. And it sort of speaks to a big pain point that I think a lot of people would have. I hope that digital app comes to New York because I would certainly get one if I didn't have to
Right.
go into DMV.
It's funny because anyone in Australia listening to that couple of sentences from you, Rondo, would be laughing because for years we've had a thing called MyGov, which essentially brings together almost all of your different agencies into one portal. Is it perfect? Not really, but if you're involved with Centerlink, which is our sort of where disability pensions and things are, or age pensions, or your tax return. For the majority of Australians, the tax return is done by the government. So basically, with
Hmm.
one button, boom, out it comes. Which
Wow.
only, only probably in the last 5 years, but that's pretty good. And we had the same experience with here in New South Wales, where I live, the Service New South Wales about a decade ago. We had that same experience that you described. That um, I can't remember the film, but there's a great scene with the sloth behind the desk of it's a kids film. I watched it with my kids, right? There's a great scene with the sloth behind the desk of the quote unquote DMV, right, where it's
Yeah.
slow. They're moving at a, really kind of like no pressure to service the customers, whatever. We had that here too, but they blew the whole thing up and recreated it around this concept called Service New South Wales, where it's just a one-stop shop for all of it, marine,
Wow.
driver's licenses, all your local, whatever, so you go in there and, there's an app too. The app is fantastic. I could show it to you right here. I've got my digital
Yeah.
driver's license on here. And yeah, it's almost too good because you know, almost in real time, if you get a traffic ticket, it's up there. You're on there, you can see them, and it is really quite convenient. But that required a complete rethink of really of the whole customer experience more than anything. It's like, how does the citizen experience this? And this was the first, and this would be about a decade ago, at least personally, it was the first time I experienced kind of almost design thinking in
Mm,
in uh, in action, where they clearly started from the frustrations of the customer and then
right.
worked back and created, fundamentally a whole new model for how that service gets delivered. And then, of course, technology capability to enable that so that you can do, I don't know, 80% of the things offline. I mean, you sell your car, you still got to drop off your plates at the place, but
Right.
virtually everything else you can do online, which is super convenient.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. So in the United States, we've gone through this process where we all had to have our a real ID, which is a federally approved IDs by I think it was May of this year. Um,
Hmm.
And that whole process was just crazy. You actually had to go in, you had to bring in all this documentation. There was nothing that you could have done online or through an app to do that. Like that would have been ideal. You're trying to get that many people to switch driver's license to this real ID. It would have been easier for it if it was on an app or you could do it online and it wasn't. So yeah, just
Right.
thinking about the customer, the citizen as the customer, and to your point, really understanding that experience for them and how you can make that experience better, to me, is one way that you start to, demonstrate that insurgent mindset. So to me, that's insurgent thinking.
I agree. And I think fundamentally it comes back to the leaders of these agencies, right? Having almost making that mindset flip, right? Which is,
Right,
it's not about us. It's not really even about our products or what we deliver. It is about the end user and how they experience that value. And then again, how do you kind of architect a solution that enables that in a way that, that's deeply meaningful to reducing the friction and things like that. So I think that's great, but it's hard because, if you're a leader in an agency, the incentives aren't necessarily anchored to the consumer. They're going to be geared
right.
towards the budget. You're going to have a culture which is largely CYA, right? I won't spell that out in case we have any kids listening, but cover the backside, right? Um,
Right,
you're going to have a culture of keep your head down, don't pop it up, don't take any risk, particularly maybe in the environment where budget cuts and things like that, and nobody wants to pop up their head. And
Right.
now that kind of creates this persistent malaise almost where you don't get that change. So it really does require people to step up and to lead and take risk. And I think, you mentioned kind of at least almost the lean startup methodology sort of
Mm,
applied to government. And that's why it doesn't get applied because, at the heart of lean startup is take a risk. You know what I
right.
mean? And iterate and try and fail. And if you fail, you learn, right? That's not part of government ethos, right? And so people default towards these very incremental, very slow kind of innovations when, you know, you get there in Colorado, like you described, someone had to say, well, this isn't working. Let's start here, customer. Let's work back and figure out, how do we streamline the whole thing and create a superior experience and at the same time take out, 40, 50, 70% of the cost. That's the
Right.
challenge.
But I think part of the tension with insurgency in government is also related to the fact that because you're dealing with 4 year, let's say in the US and the federal government, you're dealing with a 4 year political term, right? That's for 4 year administration. You have some political appointees come in. They've got 4 years. During that time, people are more risk averse to try things because of the political risk. The gotcha. Everyone's looking for the gotcha moment. And so the career work employees are just sitting there and they just wait it out because they know that the administrations are going to change. And so they're not incentivized to want to really change because they know the administrations will turn over. And transformations take, 5 to 10 years. So they're hoping that, things will the next administration will just try something different, or they just will just sit still and wait until someone fails and the political media will grab them and raise attention to it. So I think that that's also a dynamic that happens in the government that keeps it, I think disincentivizes insurgent moves inside government. Experimenting and learning and failing, that kind of stuff is not necessarily welcomed in some corners of
Not only
government.
not welcomed, but actively, actively not encouraged, right? So
Right,
that's right. And culturally, just the punishment and the penalty is high to
right,
stick your head up. So I think that
right.
is a problem. You're right. Yeah.
And then the other thing I was thinking about is how do you reconcile this tension between, the accountability role that governments plays and agility, right? So that accountability sort of slows things down. It's sort of when you and I talked about the Ezra Klein's abundance concept, right? And the
Exactly.
fact that, bureaucracy was slowing things down. But how do you find that right balance between that accountability that is one of the roles of government and agility? I think that's where some of the tension also comes in.
Yeah, preparing for this podcast, Rondo, I came across the regulatory sandbox in Utah. Have you heard of that? Um,
No.
which is a really interesting setup. What they do is they create um, under certain circumstances, the government has created a situation where they will provide regulatory relief for startup companies or people trying to do interesting and different things in Utah, so that essentially they move them out of the traditional red tape bureaucracy,
Mm,
allow them to sort of develop and grow, and then and then use that input from these um, from all these companies in this program to cycle back into their regulatory framework to see what can be streamlined, which regulations create friction, which ones are, kind of not negotiable, et cetera. And what that does is not only gives these startups or developing companies an opportunity to thrive, but it also
mm,
creates this really, really cool feedback loop for the government then to learn and adjust, to build that agile mindset into um, how do we reduce friction for business in Utah in particular, to create more innovation to make Utah more competitive. I love
hmm
that sort of because it almost ties back to the abundance concept where, you're sort of building a mechanism to allow more flexibility in how the bureaucracy works, um,
Right.
in a very deliberate way, which then is inherently agile, I think, because that sort of feedback loop allows you to change policy and regulation in a meaningful way. I really like that particular example.
That's really interesting. And it makes me think about how the charter school movement in the United States started. So, um, just for the sake of the audience, charter schools are public schools here in the US. So you have public schools and you have what we call charter schools. Charter schools are publicly funded, but the distinction is that the charter schools are not under the oversight of the educational system within that state, like in New York, for example, or New Jersey, and Massachusetts, where we operate. But
Mm,
in exchange for having that independence, you're giving a 5-year charter with some goals that you have to achieve. And for as long as you achieve those goals, you maintain your charter. But if you don't, your charter can be shut down. So that
okay.
allows the charter school to have more innovative thinking in terms of the school day, the types of teachers. So in some cases, the teachers are not in a union. There are some charters where they are in a union, but some cases they're not. So you can now decide, you want to make sure that your teachers are the best teachers in your school. So you can do that. You can change curriculum. You have more control over the curriculum. So that level of control and innovation in charter schools has allowed them to deliver, I would say, better results than their district schools that they compete against. It's having that flexibility, but also having the risk
Mm,
associated with that. Because if the charters don't perform, then they can lose their charter. Those schools
right.
can actually be closed.
Yeah. I guess that, I love that, right? So, but there's also the other leg of the stool, which is then, are they, how do they benchmark their results relative to the costs to deliver them, right? So, to me, the magic is you get a better outcome. The goal, anyway, should be that it's a better outcome on a different cost curve, right?
That's
That,
that's ex
that's the goal. And
that's
then,
exactly it.
yep,
So
yep.
if you think about, so my charter organization, Uncommon Schools, when you look at the population of scholars who we serve, low income kids, 80, 90% of our kids are getting free lunch. So that tells you something. So we look at getting our kids to and through college. That's like the benchmark ultimately that we're looking at. And when you think about non-economically disadvantaged kids, the 6-year graduation rate is like 59%. If you think about the population of kids that go to our school, the typical 6-year graduation rate is 16%. Our schools, Uncommon Schools, delivers right now we're at about 52, 53% 6-year graduation rate.
That's like,
So for the same public dollar, we're delivering, 4x results in terms of college graduation rate based on our population of students. And we're within striking distance of closing that gap with non-economically disadvantaged kids. So yeah, you're right. That is the metric for us, the ultimate, value for the dollar.
yep. I had the opportunity last summer. I won't say who it was specifically, but I spent a couple days in Boston working with one of the public hospitals in in their emergency department, and essentially, it's the best, pretty much the best run emergency department on the planet, right? So, um, I was working with a client here in Australia. They were curious about how they can improve their workflows and how to think about their emergency department in a completely different way. So we did some benchmarking and, some best practice reviews, and I did a study tour, and I came across this public hospital in Boston, and went and spent 2 days with their leadership and on the floor in the emergency room. And it was, first of all, the throughput of this thing was unbelievable. Like, the number of patients coming through this thing was like a machine gun, right? And the sheer scale of the thing just blew my mind. But what was fascinating was how deeply embedded lean was. Sort of the
Mm,
Toyota system was so deeply embedded in everything that they did, where they had um, they had worked out, just I'll give you 4 or 5 quick examples, right? So the the workflow was managed down to the second, in terms of how many steps does a doctor take during a shift, right? So they start measuring the number of steps, and their goal is to reduce the number of steps. So they reduce the workflow so that the doctor can not waste that extra 10 minutes in a shift walking between stations, right?
mm,
Um, the they studied all the different presentations and looked at how they organized their rooms. They looked at how they ingest and outgest patients in terms of where they come from, where they go. And they basically reduce friction on everything. But the orchestration, and we talk a lot about orchestration here, right? The orchestration of um, doctors, nurses, patients, specialists, catering. I could go on all day, right? There's about 40 different job functions that have to be orchestrated to make all that work. So it's just a lot easier not to do it. But
yeah,
when you meet these guys, these leaders, it complete insurgent mindset, right? So these guys are like, this is really hard and there's got to be a better way, right? So interestingly, they're like, okay, how do we think totally differently about this? And then, for example, could we apply the Toyota system in an emergency setting, right? So immediately now they're looking outside. Then they find an expert that's sort of done this and they sort of work together and then they create this journey. And it's really interesting to see how that sort of insurgent mindset of how do we completely rethink emergency medicine in one place and do that really well is now set the standard globally for emergency medicine, which is fascinating. And it really is just one leader who's inspired to think about it completely differently, who says, we don't have these skills. We're doctors. We're not industrial engineers or management consultants or whatever, but we
right.
can learn these skills and we can teach these skills to nurses, to doctors, to specialists, to security guards, et cetera, et cetera. And and they did, and it's just fascinating to see. So I think it's sort of like you start to build up this idea that it isn't intractable, right? So in
Right.
government, these solutions, the things that we've learned in the private sector, and my big four, lean, as in Toyota lean, lean startup as in iterative design, iterative development, um, co-creation, co-design, and co-production, taken as one, um, and then design thinking. To me, those are the
Design thinking.
four
Yeah.
kind of big ones. And then I think to your point, you those are my four coming in, but you've added a
Yeah.
good one for me, which is sort of think about the ecosystem, which I guess is part of design thinking, but it's kind of like that, more holistic view of the system isn't just the emergency room. The system is the health system, and how does it
Right.
all fit together, right? So you're not
And how do you
alone.
deliver it? You don't have to deliver it just through your own resources, right? So thinking
Right.
differently about that.
Yeah. So I think if you're a leader in a public sector environment, right, first of all, and there are plenty of these people. I was one in my early days working with the Navy. You're a kid, you got nothing to lose, you're going to take risk. You don't really care if it doesn't work out, what's the worst thing that can happen? You know what I mean? So you're going to take those risks. But you know, I have a lot of confidence that if individuals take the risk and bring people along on the journey, you can create really, really impressive outcomes. But again,
Yeah.
coming back to you have to learn these skill sets, right? And these skill sets are not necessarily easily available or taught to you in a public sector environment, particularly if you're a career public servant. You probably haven't been deeply exposed to lean, right? Or you probably haven't done a startup, so you don't even know what a lean startup is, and so on, right?
Right.
So you don't have access to these techniques, but you need to learn them, but it really, to me, it comes down to leadership. Like someone's got to take the risk and then reward the risk.
Yeah, and to your point, it's really a mindset shift for that leader, right? So you really have to be willing to sort of flip established way of thinking, established ways of doing things, and then that opens you up to being able to look outside, to look for, best practices or other practices that you can bring in that could help.
Exactly. So then, then the transformation, because if you're not doing that, you're going to feel really lonely, right? Like
Hmm.
you're trying to do something here, but a way not to feel lonely about that is to go out into the world and explore. Go to Denver and see what they're doing. Go and look at the Service New South Wales and really understand how they've condensed this workflow and changed the cost curve and things like that. Go to
Yeah.
Utah and look at the sandbox. Read Ezra Klein's book about abundance, right? There's a lot of stuff out there that can kind of really um, can help you change the mindset and then get into transformation mode where you start applying these best practice capabilities to solve particular problems to achieve those outcomes that you described at Uncommon Schools, where fundamentally, how do you know you're being successful? Well, you've substantially improved the outcome for the stakeholder, and you've substantially changed the cost curve, right?
Yeah.
That's the metric. And I don't know that this, particularly the cost curve side of it, it's probably harder to conceptualize for a lot of people in public service because they will tell you, well, it's not really about the money, it's about the mission. But
Right.
realistically, the mission and the money are almost always intertwined. And figuring out how to kind of find that shift is really important. Today is the global ADHD conference, right? So I just kicked off that conference a few minutes before we started this podcast.
Right.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And it's a not so much me, but a huge accomplishment for the team. But, we sort of almost started with a clean sheet with ADHD Australia. And it was really interesting. This is a not-for-profit, not a government organization, but they often have many of the same characteristics. But, in our mind was how do we create impact for a million, 1.2, 1.5 million people that are affected by ADHD with a very low amount of resources? And how do we architect a model to achieve that? And that's kind of been the journey that we've been on. And it's been very interesting and exciting. We've learned a lot, made some mistakes along the way, but we have quite a large organization, but a small budget. And
Mm,
it's really interesting to see how that sort of how you can create that mindset amongst a bunch of really motivated people who care about the mission, but understand that you have to do everything on a shoestring. So
right.
it's really interesting.
Awesome.
Anyway, so I couldn't resist, Rondo, but very proud of the team, and we've done a lot of great work. But at the same time, I think the lessons are, if you're a leader in the public sector, this sort of transformation is possible, and being able to create almost a viral insurgent mindset amongst a group of people, it can happen. And I saw it in Boston in this emergency room where you go and talk to a doctor on shift, and this guy who's been a doctor, nothing but a doctor for 25 years, can rattle off the lean principles right off the top of his head, right? And
Mm,
and then the nurse comes into the conversation and starts talking about, you can just see it. And
right.
that insurgent mindset in a public setting is I think not only possible but necessary in this environment where we've got declining, just there are fewer resources to go around. So we got to think
Yeah.
completely differently about these agencies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great.
So are we done?
I think we are near the end of our conversation today.
Wow, that went pretty quick. This is an area I'm super passionate about, Rondo. You probably see that. I think disruption in government is necessary, and we really have to lean into that. I think the challenge for people like us is that just the bureaucracy to be able to bring these capabilities into agencies is really high with high barriers. So we keep trying to fight the good fight one at a time, I suppose.
Yeah, and I would say that, as we close that, the insurgent mindset in government is really focused around four different areas, right? You really have to see the citizens as customers. You have to be thinking about simplification, rather than complexity. So how do you simplify a complex organization? You you focused me on when I was talking about a comment on what are the results that you're getting, right? So it's really building that trust through the results that you deliver. Colorado's doing that. The revised approach to the healthcare.gov in the US did that. And then how do you think about, balancing accountability with sort of this agility and speed that comes? That I think that's another element when you're thinking about that insurgent mindset in government that leaders need to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, and I would say that it doesn't just have to, it isn't always, or usually it's not the senior leader that starts this journey. It's someone in the
Hmm.
middle that that just keeps putting their hand up and taking the risk and going out there and making this stuff happen, educating people, kicking goals and making things happen. And so if you're out there and you're in that role, um, take note because it's possible and you can drive that transformative change.
Awesome.
Good stuff. All right, Rondo. So let's wrap up. Another great discussion, and just encourage everybody to join us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts so that you can get more of this great content. And look forward to chatting with you again next time, Rondo.
Absolutely. Thanks, Matt.